Hello and welcome to Chapter 8. This chapter takes a look at corrections from an international perspective. We begin this chapter with a terminology. Comparative penology is the broad category that we're going to be looking at. And the general question asked by those who are interested in comparative penology is how countries can be compared in terms of their penal sanction. It's a question that is more complicated than what might first appear, simply because of the great variety of ways in which things can be counted. Just a couple of examples, as are mentioned in your textbook. Two authors, Cavadino and Dignan, tried to compare the contemporary capitalist societies and find the highest imprisonment rates amongst those countries that they identify, that is Cavadino and Dignan identify as being neoliberal countries. And that meant that Australia, England and Wales, the United States ended up being countries that had high imprisonment rates compared to other types of countries. Riddell and Urbino found more heterogeneous countries are more punitive. And they measured punitiveness by the presence of the death penalty and the imprisonment rate. What they're basically saying is that the greater diversity there is in a country, that is the greater diversity in terms of ethnicity and race, for example, minority members, the more punitive that country tends to be. When countries are more homogeneous, that is when they are much more similar to one another, then the countries tend not to have very punitive standards. Those are just two ways that authors have tried to look at comparative penology and to figure out ways in which countries can be looked at against one another. They're both very good ways, but they also, as you can well imagine, get rather complicated and involved, much more so than what we need to do for this type of a class. And so what we're going to do instead is just look at a very simple kind of difference among countries, the sentence type, and what kind of sentences are used and how those sentences are used in different countries. And we're going to look at four specific sentencing types: financial penalties, corporal and capital punishment, non-custodial sanctions, and custodial sanctions. And we begin with the financial penalties, considered by most countries to be the least punitive of the different penalties that are possible. In this country, in the United States, we tend to think of financial penalties primarily in terms of fines, and even more specifically in terms of fixed fines, or sometimes called tariffs. These are very popular in the United States. In fact, there are many studies that suggest that it's the most frequently used penalty when you take into consideration petty offenses, misdemeanors, and even some felonies for which fines can be given by the judge. Fines, of course, can be standalone penalties in the sense that your only punishment is payment of a fine, or they can be linked to some other kind of penalties. So you could be placed on probation, for example, and be required to pay fines on top of it. But the standard is that's a fixed fine, so that everybody who is found guilty of a similar act presumably is fined at a similar level. Doesn't make much difference what kind of offense or what kind of particulars that might be linked to the offense. It just seems like a most fair way to do it. Two people committing similar crimes get fined in a similar manner. That differs from the way that fines are used in other countries, especially in Europe, where the day fine is very popular. I'm going to elaborate on this in the next slide, so I won't do more than just mention it here. It's very popular in, as I said, in Europe. Germany is the example that we're going to be using. Basically, the idea here is to provide separate calculations of the fine's penalty, and in doing so, make it a more fair penalty, based not so much just on what the offense was, but fairness based upon your ability to pay. Well, as I said, I'll come back to that in just a few moments. Another type of financial penalty are referred to as compensation penalties. And compensation can be made to either victims or the community, or to both. One particular example of this is diya, which is popular under Islamic law, and many of the Middle Eastern countries make use of diya. It is specifically used in the casus offenses, which you will recall from chapter 4, is that type of offense under Islamic law for which retaliation is required. What we didn't maybe mention, although your textbook pointed it out, but I might not have mentioned it in the PowerPoint lecture, is that under Islamic law, it is very, not so much under the Islam religion, it's very, very important for persons to be able to show forgiveness of their fellow citizens. And diya fits into this very, very nicely. Those individuals who have been harmed, victims of a crime, who can forgive their offender, are seen as pleasing Allah. That is seen as being a very desirable kind of thing to do. And so while we in the Western world, or the non-Muslims, might think of the payment to a victim as being a rather crass kind of offering, under Islam and under Islamic law, when the victim willingly accepts payment for the offense, it's a way of showing forgiveness to the offender and puts the victim in strong standing as far as Allah is concerned, for example. So under diya you have the right for the victim to basically say, I will forgive the offender, and instead of putting the offender through some kind of corporal or capital punishment or long term of imprisonment, the offender can pay me compensation for the harm that was done. And it can be compensation for both a property and a violent crime. And that compensation is calculated according to, well, originally according to rulings in the Quran and the Sunnah. More recently, there are other ways to calculate what a fair compensation amount might be. But it's seen as being an appropriate way and desirable way, even from the victim's perspective, to handle a wrong. Donation penalties we see occasionally in some countries. Again, European examples are more frequently found in maybe some other countries. Here the financial penalty compensates the broader community, not just the victim. The textbook uses Germany as the example. Misdemeanor offenders can avoid trial and conviction by simply paying money to the victim, to a charitable organization, or to the state. And when we're using the term donation penalties, we're thinking more of these latter two, the charitable organization or to the state. In a sense, kind of like you might find in the United States and other communities where individuals are required to do community service, for example. But that doesn't typically involve a financial payment as well. Donation penalty wouldn't be satisfied simply by going down and working at the local homeless shelter for a while. You would have to actually give money to the organization for it to count as a donation penalty. As I said, we're going to elaborate just a little bit on the day fine system. One of the criticisms of the fixed fine system that's so typical in the United States is that while it seems fair in terms of everybody committing a similar crime gets a similar financial penalty, it's also seen as being unfair by those who believe that charging or fining an individual who makes $1,000 a month the same amount that you would fine an individual who makes $5,000 a month isn't fair to the person, well, to either person actually. When the attention is paid only to the offense and not to the ability to pay, you are setting up some inequities that the day fine is designed to alleviate. The basic idea here is that you fine the individual, the offender, in a way that's proportionate to the seriousness of the crime, but also to the amount of money that the individual being fined has available. So there are two components under the day fine system. You link, first of all, the fine amount to the severity of the crime, but then you also link it to the offender's financial situation. Your textbook gives an example, just kind of repeated here. We'll say that in Germany, for example, both Stefan and Rudolf have been convicted of assault. It's a very serious crime, and by the way, fines are used in Germany and other countries that use the day fine system for crimes of violence as well as for property crimes, something that we wouldn't find happening quite so often in the United States, where it's primarily used for property offenses or petty offenses. But back to the example, Stefan and Rudolph have been convicted of assault, a serious crime valued at 20 punishment units, as opposed to a less serious crime, which might only be 5 punishment units, or even a more serious crime than assault, which could be 25 or 30 punishment units. So anyway, the law stipulates that the crime of assault is a 20 punishment unit fine. Each unit is seen as being 1 day's net pay. Now in Stefan's case, this would be 50 euros. In Rudolph's case, it would be only 30 euros, since Stefan makes more money, we're saying, than what Rudolph does. The judge then sentences each to 75 day fines. But instead of them ending up paying a similar overall amount, we get a difference based upon, again, that amount that they have available given their income. So Stefan ends up paying 1,000 euros, that is 50 euros that he makes per day, times 20 punishment units. Rudolph, on the other hand, will be fined 600 euros because he only makes 30 euros per month. However, he is fined the same number of punishment units because he also committed assault, and assault is a 20 punishment unit crime. So you see that the use of the day fine then is a way to make more equitable the punishment based upon the offender's expendable, not so much expendable, but net income, rather than the fixed fine, which makes the punishment based more upon what the crime itself was. So the fine amounts differ, but each offender presumably is affected in a similar manner. Corporal punishment, and more specifically here we're talking about judicial corporal punishment, is applied as a sentence. We're distinguishing that from corporal punishment that is used during interrogation as a way to gain information from the person being interrogated. Corporal punishment in that sense can be used in a wide variety of situations, but we're talking about only punishment here, and so we're restricting it to more correctly the term judicial corporal punishment. An example of somebody being sentenced to corporal punishment refers to any kind of punishment of the body or inflicted on the body. Probably the examples that you are most familiar with would be amputation, which is used in several countries, Saudi Arabia being one example. But it's also considered contrary to international standards that prohibit torture and cruel punishment. And I mention that because Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and other international organizations that pay attention to these kinds of things believe that corporal punishment might actually be handed down in more countries than care to admit it, simply because those countries understand that it is not seen as being an appropriate punishment in contemporary world. Saudi Arabia and other Islamic countries will still hand down penalties of amputation, but those are, I won't say often, but are sometimes overturned at a higher level. We also should keep in mind that amputation of a hand, for example, in the case of theft under Saudi Arabia law, or under Saudi Arabia's version of Islamic law, requires an extremely high level of evidence in order to convict a person for this type of a crime. This was mentioned briefly in one of the earlier chapters as well, the idea that even though Islamic law has very severe penalties, the crimes for which those penalties are applied have to meet extremely high levels of evidence. And because of that, even though we hear about thefts in which the offender's hand has been amputated, it certainly happens, but it doesn't happen whenever a theft has occurred, for example. Other kinds of corporal punishment that still occur today, whipping, and that includes flogging somebody with a cane, for example. So Singapore, you've heard possibly about cases of caning as being the punishment that's been handed down. It certainly occurs more often than amputation does. It's the sentence for a number of different offenses and is still used in Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore as being some of the examples where whipping is considered to be the appropriate punishment for some offenses. That concludes part 2 I'm sorry, concludes part 1 of chapter 8. We will now move to part 2 on the next slide, or the next video, and that will be covering capital punishment, and then we'll also take a look at both custodial and non-custodial sanctions. Thank you for your attention.